So much for joining us today. I lead our strategy team as part of our on-site team, and for years, pricing has been one of the hottest topics and tons of questions that we get from our portfolio companies. So that led us to bring James Wood on as a full-time member of the team to lead our pricing strategy this summer and work closely with our portfolio companies. James brings a lot of pricing experience. He spent several years at Simon Kucher and Partners. That's a leading pricing consultancy, and he also ran pricing at Segment, which is a growth stage technology company focused on customer data infrastructure. So with that, I'm delighted to hand it over to James, and really excited for both his presentation and also all of your questions that we hope to be able to answer today. So take it away, James.
Thank you, Rachel and Christina. So just to kind of, without further ado, get started, I wanted to first frame exactly what we're going to be talking today in terms of what is kind of good pricing and where does this sit in the roadmap. So the ideal state for good pricing is that your price and value go up in kind of lockstep. So you increase your price and you increase your value, which leads to more revenue overall. But you're never kind of too far off the kind of consistency point of price equaling value. If you're overpriced, obviously customers will start to churn. You'll start to get negative feedback. If you're underpriced, obviously you're not capturing as much revenue as possible. So this webinar is designed to give you some kind of first look at some of the topics that can help you to increase your price and your value alongside each other. So just talking then into how do we make this actionable? What are the steps we can go from? The first step, and I'd encourage everyone to do this as soon as possible, is take an assessment. Understand where your opportunities are in pricing. We'll go through some points in this webinar of how can you identify the opportunity? Where should you look? Tactically, I'd say interview or survey some of your execs and key go-to-market leaders is a great step to really understand a little bit more about your pricing, the world of your kind of pricing, and then using some data to really understand and deep dive into some of these opportunities. And then from there, and as we go through, we'll talk about which topics go into kind of quick wins and which topics will go into really big strategic initiatives. But I would say quick wins, for instance, can be just changing your price book. What are the dollar amounts that you charge? As you go into bigger, longer term projects, and these might take anywhere from kind of 3 to 6 months, you're looking at, okay, how do I completely change the way that my product is architected in order to really sell the value of it and really able to price to the market and what the market wants. So without further ado, I'm going to step into kind of the meat of today's presentation. And we're going to take this and focus on 2 main areas. So the first one, and this is something that comes up all the time in questions that we get asked, is how do you go about thinking about developing a differentiated pricing model, and how do you do it? So there are 2 main components to that. The first is using packaging to develop feature differentiation to separate what customer A gets from customer B. The second is using your price model and metric to distinguish, let's say, user tiers or different customers from in terms of usage. And that is effectively, how do you grow? How do you get your customers to grow with you as their usage grows? The second topic that we're going to talk about is a few key things that come up as your company starts to scale. How do you adapt your price over time to match different markets and things that crop up as you grow? So the first one is scaling into enterprise, something that comes up all the time. How do you adapt your pricing model to match the needs and demands of enterprise customers? Second one is, how do we scale pricing into different regions? So now our company's in EMEA, for instance, now our company is in APAC. How do we make sure that our pricing model works across the entire world? The third one is, how do you execute pricing through your sales force? How do you make sure that what you're designing in your pricing strategy is actually hitting the ground through your sales? And finally, how do you make sure that at point of renewal, your pricing scales effectively? So how do you make sure that you're getting consistent customer growth, revenue growth year over year? So that's the kind of intro and the agenda. Just each one of these, I'm going to go through some slides, and then I'll do a Q&A on developing a differentiated pricing model, and then another Q&A on pricing at scale. So that's the way that's going to go. And without further ado, I'm going to go into how to develop a differentiated pricing model. So how do we identify opportunity to differentiate more? And I'm going to split that into packaging and pricing model. They are interlinked, but it's best often to think of them slightly separately to understand where your opportunities lie. In packaging, some of the key kind of things that I think about when I go, okay, is there opportunity here? If attach rates for secondary products that you sell are really low, so let's say 70% plus of your customers are only buying one product, then you've probably got opportunity to expand that and to cross-sell more. If sales complain about complexity in multi-product deals, that probably suggests that your packaging is too complex to really make the most of the different product offerings you have. If you have more than 20 different product SKUs, that will typically lead to complexity. I'd say there's usually room for optimizing there. And finally, if the top package or all product packages you sell are unlimited and have no room for growth, that's something that I would always step away from, because as you scale as a company, as you improve your product, that is going to be limiting the amount of revenue you can get from your customers. Then switching over to pricing model, how do we tell if there's room for improvement? I would say that if your model or metric is limiting the way that your customers use your product, or if it's not charging for it, then there's definitely room for improvement there. If the metric is not aligned to the way that your customers think about economic value, then that's not perfect. And if your price metric is the main driver of negative customer satisfaction, that's something that you want to step away from and avoid altogether. From one spectrum, you effectively have the most inflexible and simple model, which is all you can eat. That's effectively one product that is sold one way to all customers. Across the spectrum into the most flexible model, which is build your own. Completely everything is set up in its own way. Like AWS, for instance, you have a massive shopping cart of instances, and you purchase each one individually, and you effectively build your own product solution from every product that they sell. Now, in between here is three different ways of bundling features and products together into effectively a solution that works for different customers. So the simplest in this, and let's say the kind of most old school version of this, is what's called category bundling. So that's selling each functional product as its own thing. So if you take, for instance, a word processor, Microsoft Word, a slide solution, Microsoft PowerPoint, and a spreadsheet, Microsoft Excel. All of these together are sold as their own products. Then you bundle within them, for instance, but effectively that selling each functional product is category bundling. And the two I kind of want to focus on are good, better, best, and use case packages. So you might be familiar with, for instance, Salesforce's pricing, which is good, better, best. They have a basic going up to an enterprise package. And within this, there's different tiers of functionality and features. So the idea is that a customer who isn't familiar with the product might be kind of upsold from the basic onto the next tier. Finally, they'll want the features that come with the enterprise solution, and they'll kind of grow their usage and grow their product purchase that way. The second one is you package by use cases. And this could, for instance, be modular. So you sell, for instance, in Zendesk, you have a support function, and you might also have a kind of customer online chat. And the two might be sold as separate products. If you want both, then you buy both. But as you as the customers kind of increase their use case, increase the need of using your product, then you'll sell more product to them over time. And the advantage of the kind of good, better, best and use case packages is that you can design bundles in a way that maximize the customer willingness to spend effectively. You can get some customers to buy more than they would originally in, let's say, a build your own model by smartly putting together these features into bundles. So if we look at how do you construct a bundle, you're effectively kind of looking at the core. You want some core products, which are standout products or features that will drive a customer's purchase decision. And so taking an example of selling a desktop computer, admittedly something that isn't done anywhere near as much anymore as in the early 2000s, but that would be your computer tower. That's the product that, if it was sold alone, that's the core product that everyone needs to buy, and they might add on accessories to that, but that's the thing that really leads them to buy the product in the first place. The second are supplementary products. So these are medium value products, some products that add utility to the bundle, but they wouldn't necessarily be purchased in isolation. If you sold a computer to a customer, you may not necessarily sell them a monitor or a keyboard or a mouse. They might get it somewhere else if you didn't bundle them together. However, including these in the bundle changes the purchase decision and pushes customers to buy more than they otherwise would. Now, the final one on this is detrimental products. So these are products or features which, if included, some customers or many customers would try and take them out and ask for a discount on the bundle altogether. So if you take a printer, which might work across multiple computers, a lot of customers might already buy that if they were going to buy a new computer. They might already have that if they're going to buy a new computer. Therefore, they wouldn't need another printer by including it. So customers wouldn't necessarily want this even for free, and they might ask for a discount on the bundle if it was included. So that's why you see kind of monitor, keyboard, and mouse included in a lot of bundles, but you fairly rarely see a printer. Now, if we think about how do we get to kind of great packaging strategy, I kind of split this roadmap into 3 points. So in the basic, you might want to pursue simple differentiation, selling a la carte features, so a kind of build your own model, to enable you to understand product purchase, understand the value of different products and features, and to effectively understand where you can differentiate to begin with. Then stepping up from this, I'd recommend kind of using bundles to maximize how customers might use features and to maximize the willingness to pay. And then finally, kind of moving into building packaging thinking for all new features around your go-to-market approach. So every time you think about developing a new feature or product, you'll think about how is it placed within the bundle, and how does it work with the upsell and cross-sell dynamics of your product portfolio as a whole. Cool. So that's a little bit on product differentiation, and I'm going to step quickly through into the price model. So price model can be a pretty complex world. There's a lot of different options that you can look at. So effectively, it kind of splits into price metric and price structure. Your price metric is what you charge on. So Salesforce example, this might be users. Some companies will do usage-based. Some companies might base it on the overall company size, for instance. Then the price structure is how does that go to market. So if it's a per user, then it's a variable. It's a linear model. If it's a flat rate, let's say it's based on number of employees in a company, and you have a tier up to 500,000, something like that, then that would be effectively a flat rate. In between that, you have, let's say, a minimum commit of 5,000 and additional users are charged from that point. Now, it's very easy to build something that's mathematically perfect, but incredibly complex to sell and execute through this. So what I'd recommend on this is retaining simplicity is key to how you're actually going to market with this. With your value metric, that is your main pricing metric. So this could be something that's either continuous or tiered. I'd say absolutely do not do more than one of these. The way that you kind of, if you have a big matrix of two different value metrics, then it starts to get basically impossible for sales to sell and customers to understand. And when you're setting this, the best practice is for it to be predictable and fair to customers. So it doesn't over advantage some customers versus others. Customers can understand it at the point of sale. It has to be tied to the value that your product delivers. So does the product that you're selling actually work and expand as this metric expands? And finally, it has to be something that you can audit and then implement properly. So you can tell how much different customers are using of that metric. Now, if you want to add in new metrics to this, I would recommend not doing it as a continuous flow. So not doing for instance, per user and a per number of employees as a kind of sliding scale. But what you could do, for instance, is a per user and 3 different company size bands. So up to 1,000, 1,000 to 5,000, 5,000 plus. And that is a way of reducing the complexity of the additional metrics while still building in some kind of differentiation. Now, wherever possible, I'd recommend tying these to different packages or to different price books. So for instance, you could have different price books. Each salesperson might sell, you might have a SMB sales team, you might have a mid-market sales team and an enterprise sales team. Now, each salesperson will only operate within one of these fencing metrics, and that minimizes the amount of negotiable elements that the customers can start to game around as they get into a heavy negotiation. Now, finally, on the price model, I'd recommend only do one per segment or customer. If you want to do, for instance, a more fixed model that's preferred by enterprise or mid-market, then that's absolutely fine. SMBs might prefer more flexibility and are willing to pay for the growth. But again, tie it to the packages, price books, the way that your sales team operate wherever possible. Because if you're trying to sell 2 different price models simultaneously, the customer will start to game in between and choose the best option, the path of least resistance that they want. Now, so how does that kind of work into a roadmap? The absolute kind of basic is, and I'd recommend looking at this as soon as possible, is make sure that your price metric is directly tied to value. Your price metric should effectively be your primary growth lever at renewal. And if it isn't, if your customers are just staying the same or even contracting because of it, then start to rethink how you do it. Now, after this point, think about how your price model works and use it to drive growth in that metric. So, for instance, about 2-3 years ago, Atlassian shifted from user tiers, where they would typically find kind of customers getting stuck at the top of that tier, to a per user model. And it enabled for a smoother growth path over time. Now, the expert is pretty much optimizing how your model and metric works by each segment. So you might differ from enterprise compared to SMB. Now, that's pretty much a kind of whistle-stop tour between the differentiation of packaging and price model. I'll open up to some questions, and Rachel should kind of guide through them.
Great, thanks, James. And if everyone can just submit their questions through the forum, I'll ask them now, and if we'll probably only have time for a few questions right now, and we'll have more time for questions at the end. James, the first question that we got is around timing. So how do you think about the right time to change your pricing and packaging? And there's actually a few different components to the question, because I think, changing your price metric or thinking about your price metric and thinking about your bundling, can be interrelated. But the question is, like, when should you think about all of that? Are there times that you should do each of those separately? And what advice do you have for everyone on that?
So the first thing I'd say is that you should avoid changing your price model or kind of your pricing strategy too often. It's going to confuse customers, and it's going to make it somewhat harder to implement over time. So it's going to kind of mean that you go one way, maybe go the other, and customers are going to stop being on a path. You will also run into some really hard migration questions over time as well. I'd kind of focus on what is the highest kind of bang for buck in terms of, is there packaging opportunity or is there price model opportunity? If there's significant opportunity in both, then I'd recommend clubbing them all together, doing a big strategy engagement and really working through kind of redesign your entire revenue model in order to, so that you're not kind of switching one and then 6 months later switching the other. Typically, packaging is going to make it somewhat harder to implement, because you'll usually need to change the product around how you package as well. So sense the opportunity, understand how much opportunity there is, and if there's opportunity across the board, across the spectrum, then I'd recommend waiting and doing everything at once.
Okay, great, thanks. We've gotten a couple questions about pricing metrics. So first, maybe if you could go into a little bit more detail around like a practical example around actual pricing metrics, and what do you see most frequently in the market? And you actually have a page where you have a lot of them listed. James, you could maybe go back to that, but maybe also just talk to the different attributes. And then there's actually one other related question that I'll give you, because maybe you can answer both at once. But there was another question around, how do you think about price metrics when you're selling the same product into different verticals, where you might actually have different customers who have, you know, a difference in terms of the alignment on the value realized for each of their verticals. So two different questions, but all related to some examples on the different metrics themselves.
Yeah, so in terms of specific price metrics, and I'll kind of go back to say, okay, how should you think about this? Or maybe what's the, I guess, stack rank of what makes a good metric? Because you're going to struggle to have a perfect metric that ticks all the boxes for every segment at once. So you will need to make choices through this. One example of a metric that is close to perfect, for instance, is Salesforce pricing per user. Every additional kind of user that you add to Salesforce is typically a revenue generating person within your business. Therefore, it's a very clear path between what Salesforce is charging for and the value that they're getting through Salesforce. So I'd always say number one should be, does that metric tie with the value that you drive? However, if you take, and users as a good example of this, because of companies like Salesforce's success, because it's been a fairly standard operating procedure within the software world for some time, a lot of companies will price per user when they won't necessarily see value per user. And so I'd say with some companies, I've seen companies that will price per user, but actually their whole product is around reducing costs, or maybe even reducing headcount. So as your product gets more and more successful, you'll be reducing the amount of users and basically downselling yourself. So tied to value is the absolute number one that I'd say. Then the second one I'd say is how do customers perceive it? Is it predictable? Is it something that they and this comes more into the world of doing a usage-based metric. So for instance, number of API calls or number of end users that are using the product. Is it something that a customer coming in can understand and imagine, okay, in 6 months, I'm going to have this many API calls or something like that? If it's something that isn't predictable, and it's going to really slow down your sales process, it's going to make it a lot harder for customers to be comfortable with the way that you're selling that metric. And then finally, but still very important, is can you track it? Can you audit it and implement it at the end of the day? So is it something that your customers you are able to say, okay, customer X is using, let's say 100,000. API calls, something like that. If it's not possible to do that, then you're going to have to come up with some pretty creative ways of understanding and then kind of holding customers to account for the amount of usage that they have. Hope that answers the question in terms of what's most important, and also some examples at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, James. We're getting a bunch of more questions around some of the pricing execution that we're going to cover in the next section. So let's move on to that, and hopefully we'll have time to answer a couple more pricing and packaging questions at the end as well.
Perfect. Yeah, and yeah, apologies for the slightly for the time lost with the technical issues. And so moving on then to what are some of the things that come up when you're starting to scale. So let's say, okay, you've got a nicely differentiated product strategy and you're growing as a business. What are some of the things that start to test up, make it a little bit harder for that pricing strategy to work perfectly? Now, the first one is enterprise. And this is something that comes up particularly after kind of 10 to 15 million ARR as you start to move into selling to enterprises, your company becomes more enterprise ready. Often your pricing metric and your pricing strategy overall should be adapted to suit that, because it's a completely different buying process. It's a completely different way of operating and completely different kind of overall sales process. So procurement will start to challenge the unit economics, really hold your metrics to account over time. Your mid-market contracts or subsidiary contracts you've got with subsidiary companies will start to anchor your pricing really low, because enterprises typically have a higher willingness to pay. And then kind of the gaps in your product or gaps in your packaging are starting to be used as a negotiation battering ram. We've seen all of these pretty frequently, and that's a good indication that you've got some opportunity there. Then moving on into geographies, and as you start to grow as a company, you'll start to expand into different geographies. So if you start in EMEA, you might start to expand into North America, and vice versa. And often these different regions will buy differently, either culturally or because the custom mix you have in each is different. So you'll have different value drivers that might lead to even a different metric being optimal in different regions. You'll have difference in willingness to pay, which means that you should consider how you discount and consider your price level across those. And you'll have kind of differences in the unit economics. So you might want to restructure your tiers or restructure the way that your price model works. Finally, and these are two slightly more broad topics that apply more consistently to every company that I see. The sales team controlling the way that they price, controlling the way that they discount becomes harder and harder as scale. So discounts start to follow no pattern. You're leaving money on the table. Your price approval processes are either not being followed, or every deal is going to the head of sales or CFO. Obviously, they can't keep track of absolutely every deal. And sales complaints of not understanding pricing or it being too complex for them to accurately sell. Now, finally, we will look at kind of how do you price at renewal. So over time, as you've got more and more customers in that renewal flow, you might be leaving money on the table by not making sure that each customer gets a price increase at the end of the year. So we'll talk briefly about that. Now, talking about adjusting pricing into enterprise, let's say you've got some of these things that you've assessed that there's opportunity there. How do you go and operate on it? The first one is actually allow for flexibility in enterprise. So allow enterprise teams some special kind of custom contract terms that are allowed for them, allow them more flexibility with price levels and discounts, allow them to build products custom. Now, typically, and this goes slightly against the concept of kind of simple pricing, but as a way to test the water and understand what the enterprise market needs, the enterprise is the one place you can really do that, because you've got, let's say, much longer sales cycles. You might have 3 or 6 month sales cycles. That allows you more time to negotiate and discuss different options. And by allowing this flexibility in a structured way, so always make sure it's orchestrated by deal desk or contract management, it allows you to understand the market a lot better and a lot quicker than you would if you had locked everyone down and waited for and just waited for it to break. After you've kind of gone through some time of understanding that market, start to formalize things. So start to create an enterprise price book. That means that the enterprise team have kind of sales enablement about how to sell there. Maybe differentiate, so launch an enterprise package, for instance, or launch different service levels that are targeted towards enterprise, and use what you've understood with the custom product builds to build it into your packaging and kind of close the identified product gaps or table stakes that your enterprise customers need. Finally, going into kind of expert territory, that is where I'd say the deal by deal, how do you sell value? So, for instance, thinking about how do you build a business case that is targeted towards your enterprise customer, targeted towards the economic buyer at your enterprise, and really sells, here's the dollar amount improvement to your business or to your bottom line that our product will bring. Invest in kind of AR analyst reports and relations. Make sure that kind of Gartner, etc., really understand the way that your product works and can sell it in their kind of reporting, and also look at things like Forrester TEI reports, which is kind of a more scaled version of value consulting, and then build a kind of support engine that will really scalably sell customization and professional services across the board. Now, moving into regional pricing, assuming you've kind of got the opportunity, I'd recommend starting in a similar way, just start to learn and adjust. So track the pricing performance of different regions separately as soon as you have a different sales team, as soon as you have a new office or different sales team that is selling specifically into that region. Then differentiate your discount allowances between those regions, start to tweak in a very scalable way the way that your discount approval flow works, for instance. And again, similar to enterprise, allow some custom contract terms to account for some of these regional differences. Similar to enterprise, then once you've learned a little bit more of that market, maybe you're 6 to 12 months into operating properly in that market, start to lock things down, start to differentiate price books, regions, price levels or price books by region, differentiate some product packaging, potentially offer local currency support. And then going on to the expert, how do you kind of fully customize this, start to do local language support, regional infrastructure, and completely change your product and packaging per feature set. I'd say that's really something that will come later on in the day. Gonna kind of quickly go through the sales force and how do you execute pricing through a sales force. So there's room for improvement, or kind of once you've identified room for improvement, I'd really recommend as soon as possible start to implement discounting controls. I've seen a lot of companies a lot kind of larger than where I'd recommend, who don't yet have the full discounting controls in place, and at this point they're often leaving tens of millions of dollars in ARR on the table, but simply through discounting procedures and practices. As the sooner you can get some level of control and build a culture around good discounting, the better that you're able to kind of grow as a company. Going on from that is building the sales enablement to really enhance that culture. So how do you give sales more guidance on what the discount should be for different customers? How do you set target prices per segment? How do you classify and formalize discounts? So hey, we'll give a discount for a case if a customer agrees to do a case study, but that doesn't go into your discretionary discounting budget and things like that. And finally, kind of train sales onto how to sell value and how to avoid kind of over discounting and things like that. Then the expert, and this is because it's typically somewhat harder to implement, is align your incentives. So give sales target kind of spiffs or incentivize them based on what the price that they've achieved actually is, and make sure that they're kind of the way that they're incentivized works along the way that you actually want to discount at the end of the day. Finally, on the renewal side, the basic, what we'd really recommend getting into as soon as possible is build some form of regular price increase into your contract. We'd typically say an inflation plus 5% increase, and obviously it can be negotiated from there. But it plants a stake in the ground. It makes customers aware that you have developed your product, you have improved the way that you're serving them, and even if they don't buy more product or don't increase their usage of the metrics, they should that there's a kind of price to pay for that R&D and development that goes into their product. From there, start to specify how your increase is across customers. So start to create communication and present to different customers, hey, we built this feature that you really use into your product. This is something that you're getting used on day by day, and that's why the increase goes. So it kind of ties together from the customer view. Okay, I understand why I'm getting this increase. It's not just a flat kind of inflation plus 5%. And you can differentiate the prices according to, for instance, how much they've used the features you've developed in the last 12 months. Then finally, on kind of the expert track, align your account manager, customer success incentives with the renewal and upsell. So give them a different rate for the flat renewal amounts and dollar amounts that were existing in the contract, and a higher rate for something that's above the past contract. And that's really similar to the sales track, and ensuring that the salespeople are incentivized to drive value into your business. So that was a bit of a whistle stop tour through all four. Now we can kind of open up to questions on each of them, and Rachel, I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, and thanks everyone for the questions. There was a follow-up on some of the renewal questions around, how do you think about price increases at renewal in, self-service models, and how do you need to build that into kind of your initial pricing package?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think with self-service, obviously it's a lot harder to say, okay, your contract has changed year over year. You kind of have to do that en masse across all customers. I would definitely recommend reviewing your price level through the self-service model and changing it, let's say, at least every 12 months, so that as customers renew, they get onto that. And then the question is, how do you migrate? Because with self-service contracts, it's a lot harder you can't just redraw the contract year on year. You'd have to break the service and restart. So I'd say at certain points, and this might be on a longer term, but you should effectively drive the migration of those customers onto the new price points. Eventually, as you build that into your contract language, you might be able to make sure that as you change your price level, that it flows through into the self-service. But I definitely recommend, as you change your pricing in self-service, migrate customers, let's say every 2 years, not necessarily every time they change price, but every 2 years to the new pricing. And you need to provide advanced communication in front of that, and make sure that you've got time and customer support that's dedicated to this pricing change.
Yeah, and so on that topic of migration, James, even in not self-serve models, that there was another question on this, and we're kind of going to bleed back into some packaging stuff. But I think a common thing, something someone asked about, but it's also a common thing that we see in companies around when you have several different editions of packages from over the years. How do you think about migration as you roll out changes that are primarily targeted at new logos?
Yeah, so any kind of migration can end up being a customer pain point, but obviously it's very important to do it over time so that your kind of customers are actually properly monetized. Because you'd imagine if you made the choice to, let's say, increase prices, then that's actually matching to the value that your product in the current state provides. What I would say is that if you're really early in your journey, then you'd probably be more on the kind of way of I'd recommend grandfathering in some of your original customers, some of your OG customers into the model that they had originally, because as you advance your product super quickly, as you get out of the kind of finding product market fit stage, the deltas in your pricing are going to be much bigger. So they might be a 2 or 3 times price increase. At that point, you'd want to actually scale those customers. So if you're on a sales model, you might be, okay, hey, we've really improved our product. The new pricing is 2 times what you're currently paying. We are going to increase your price by, let's say, 20%. Give them a little bit of an olive branch, and then over time, migrate them so that they're at parity with the new pricing model. And you may never get to exact parity, but just ensure that you're kind of keeping mind of that and optimizing. As you go on, as your company is more and more mature and the deltas in pricing may be 5 or 10%, you can pretty much start to auto migrate people and provide the right communication to customers, but ensure that all customers are brought along the journey. And a good example of this is Netflix. So back in 2011, they did a price change as they shifted models between DVD and streaming, which was pretty significant. And it was they tried to auto migrate all of their customers. It was a kind of big pain point, and it really hit their stock price. Over time, they've learned to optimize that model. So they've kind of started with baby steps as their streaming service really grew. And the first time they did, let's say, they'd hold prices for 2 years and then migrate people. Then it was 1 year for the next price increases. And then they're starting to move to auto migrating people as the market starts to accept that. And they start to understand that the difference in prices is not that much, and the willingness to pay is still there. So that's the kind of, as your company scales, get more aggressive with migration.
Great, thanks, James. On the topic of price increases, which can be at renewal, but also can just going back to some of the changing the pricing and packaging that we talked about earlier, how do you think about understanding customer value and how much you actually can raise prices? This is a question from one of our attendees.
Yeah, the really good question. It's a really good question. I'm gonna I'd say there's 2 main ways that I'd look at this without price testing, which is a third, but it's not typically as easy to do because there's a lot more risk of doing price changes and price testing in market. The first one is look at your data, and particularly if you're in a sales model, you've got discount data. Now, the discounted price gives you a good indication of what the true willingness to pay is. So starting to look at how discounts change by segment, starting to look at, for instance, if you're not discounting at all, pretty sure that you're underpriced, and you should start to increase your price over time until you start to see the discounts come in. Now, then the second way, and in either B2C or self-service models, taking a look at conversion and churn rates is a good indication of how much your pricing is, how kind of whether you're underpriced or overpriced. If your conversion is really low versus market benchmarks, you might well be overpriced. If your conversion is really high, then start to think about whether that's simply because you're really low priced. Then thinking on the other way, and I'd almost always recommend doing this if you're doing a major pricing change, test it with customers. Start doing some research, and I typically say start with interviewing some customers, start with talking to them, getting some really rich data about how much value you bring to them, and then start to get some indications on actually how much would they pay at the end of the day. And that there's different methodologies that you can kind of read about, for instance, Conjurant and things like that to do this, which I won't go into now. And the second thing after you've done some interviews is launch a survey more broadly across your customers, where you can actually model the impact of what's your price elasticity, what changes might a price change, or kind of what impact on your bottom line metrics, on your volume, would a price change actually do?
Great. Thanks, James. So you mentioned a little bit of discounting in this answer. There's another question around discounting, and how do you actually figure out what is the appropriate discount? And this person, I think it would be helpful to talk about that more broadly. The person who asked this question was thinking about more on the large enterprise side, and how do you do this at scale and ultimately think about what the right list price and versus discounted price is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say there's no kind of widely accepted hard and fast rule on exactly what your discount amount should be. But my typical benchmark is that your average discount should definitely be no more than 30% at the absolute worst case. Over time, as you really nail down your pricing strategy, hopefully that will fall even lower, below the 20% mark. And the other way of thinking about it is if you have, for instance, a pricing approval tier, which is 40% discount or below, or maybe 50% discount or below, that might be